In this section, we'll look at Wilson's second term domestic reforms, and ultimately we'll discuss the important point on how progressivism ended. In looking at Wilson's second term, one thing's obvious. From the 1960 election through the 1920 election, through Wilson's entire term, World War I really dominated Wilson's presidency, including the period before America entered the war in April 1917. Domestic reform politics kind of died down. There were, however, still two significant progressive accomplishments. First was the passage of the 18th Amendment, passed on December 18, 1917, prohibiting, 1 year after ratification, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. The Anti-Saloon League and the temperance movement had grown as they wisely equated prohibition with the patriotism of World War I. The movement first got the prohibition on a sale of alcohol near army bases in a selective service bill, a draft bill in 1917. It then got legislation barring the use of grain for distilling and brewing alcohol, the logic being that the army would need the grain in World War I. The 18th Amendment was finally ratified in January of 1919, and this prohibition began in January of 1920. By then, most states had begun to enforce it. People had a year to basically prepare. After ratification, in October 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act, which sought to implement the 18th Amendment and sought to guide the preparations. Passing over Wilson's veto, which was largely on technical grounds, the Volstead Act defined alcoholic beverages as those containing more than 0.5% alcohol by volume, which was a very rigid standard that therefore included not only hard liquor, but wine and all beer. Of course, as you're probably aware, the nation's prohibition experiment was a failure, and 13 years later, with the 21st Amendment, Congress ended prohibition. The second significant progressive accomplishment of Wilson's second term was the 19th Amendment, granting women's suffrage rights. That's, of course, the right to vote. It's what female activists had long sought. As a class of progressive movement, the right to vote for women spread state by state, but, as noted before, it faced stiff religious and cultural resistance, largely in the Bible Belt religious South. Passed in early June 1919, the states finally ratified it on August 18, 1920. The first presidential election in which women could vote was therefore the November 1920 election. Turning to the end of progressivism, it's fair to say that the progressive reform impulse didn't die out completely with World War I, but the way America entered the war, contrasted with the way it ended, did end the optimism that was so central to progressive reform. As we will discuss in the World War I lecture and topic, by 1917 the United States was still not in the European War, which had raged for 3 years by then. The modern industrial war had caused unprecedented destruction and wiped out a full generation of men in Europe. President Wilson was a progressive, with his optimism relying on expertise. He recognized that the total destruction of Europe was an opportunity. Experts argued that when victors took the spoils from the losers, when they harshly punished the defeated, resentment followed. A true, rational, equitable solution to the problems that had caused the war in the first place was probably not, instituted. Another war, therefore, was kind of inevitable. Wilson, the progressive, suggested if America entered the war, she might be able to determine the peace. And rather than do what other victors had done in the past, she would implement a rational post-war peace that would be equitable and fair. It's what he called a peace without victory. A peace without victory would, Wilson said, make the world safe for democracy, a famous slogan. The U.S. would listen to the losers as well as the winners, redraw the national boundaries logically and not spitefully, in the common good and not just that of the victor. In short, this kind of post-war reform would prevent a new war. Simply put, it appeared Wilson was internationalizing the progressive movement. Progressivism had gone from the local to the state and finally to the national level, and now Wilson optimistically was taking reform international. to end war forever. Sadly, as will be explained in detail in the World War I lecture, this isn't how it turned out. While the United States did enter the war and did help win it, the post-war peace plan did not well implement Wilson's reforms. In fact, in many respects, the post-World War I world appeared more threatening and more ominous than the pre-war period. The fighting appeared to have accomplished nothing. Again, we'll discuss how the post-war world suffered in the World War I lecture, but for now, it's simply enough to understand that the horrible ending of the war, after the high, lofty aspirations entering it, crushed the optimism that was central to all progressive reforms. People began to say, oh, hey man, there'll always be war. There'll always be poverty or corruption or whatever. In a sense, the sense of sacrifice for the common good, the common purpose was gone. The faith in government was gone. People were more fatalistic, more pessimistic, and they focused more on themselves, and thus the age of government reform effectively ended. The progressive era, therefore, ended with the end of World War I. The 1920s were a much different decade with much less government activism, less faith in government. The 1920s saw a few more reforms, but the progressive era, the age of reform, had ended. This concludes the section on Wilson's second term and the end of progressivism.